Now, normally when we think of millionaires, we think of people who have advanced degrees and big corporate jobs. But Ronald Read had neither of these. He had just very basic jobs, and yet he was able to amass over $8 million. How was he able to do that? What were his secrets? And what can we learn from his life? We're going to talk about that right now. Hey all, Aubrey here. Welcome to the channel where I talk about personal finance and how you can make your first million. Ronald Read was an ordinary guy, about as ordinary as you can get. Ronald Read was born in 1921. He grew up in Dummerstown, Vermont, on an impoverished farm. He walked to school every day. It was 4 miles each way, and he was the first in his family to graduate from high school. Now, along about the time he graduated, World War II was going on, so he joined the army and went off to fight in Italy. And around the time the war ended, he returned back to Vermont to Brattleboro. There he got a job working at a gas station, where he was a gas station attendant and also a mechanic. He worked there for 25 years. While he was there, in 1960, he met his wife, who just frequented the gas station. They got married, and he bought a house for $12,000. Now, his wife had 2 children. They were actually a little older, in high school, college age, and Read paid for her 2 children's college education. Then just 10 years later, this would have been 1970, his wife passed away. And it was about that time that Read decided to go back to work. He had retired from the gas station, and he took 1 year off and then went back to work at JCPenney as a janitor. He worked there for another 17 years and then retired in 1997. And he would have been 76 years old. Then in 2014, at the age of 92, Ronald Read passed away. And it was only at that time that his wealth became known. And of course, the big question at the time was, how had he done it? He never had fancy jobs. Of course, the internet had not been invented yet. He never worked at a bank or in some kind of corporation. And the simple answer to that question is through investing. Now, Read's investing strategy was through picking individual stocks. And he generally stuck with companies that he understood, that he could research, that he kind of knew their business a little bit. Companies like Smucker's, CVS, Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, and Morgan Chase. Did he invest in Bitcoin? No, not Bitcoin. He had about 95 companies that he invested in, so he was well diversified, and many of these companies paid a healthy dividend, which he would receive that and then reinvest it into his stocks. Now, it's important to note that Ronald Read did have some certain advantages, also disadvantages, throughout his investing career, we'll say. Obviously, the disadvantages are his salary was fairly modest. Read was also at a disadvantage just from the time period in which he was investing. In the 1940s and 50s and 60s and into the 70s, the whole investing sort of landscape looked much different. Nowadays, we're spoiled with ETFs and index funds and all these things that kind of take a lot of the work away from what we have to do when we want to invest. We can just go ahead and buy an S&P 500 index ETF and be done with it. But Read did not have those luxuries. In fact, the first index fund didn't come along until 1976. And even at that point, most investors were pretty skeptical about a very hands-off approach to investing. The belief at the time was that you had to individually pick your stocks, and that was why he spent a lot of time reading the Wall Street Journal every day. He had prospectuses from the different companies that he was interested in. He looked at their stock charts, and he really did a lot of research. And that enabled him to do, by most accounts, fairly well in the stock market. He did have several advantages that at first you might not notice. 2 largest expenses that most people face as they continue through their lives are the housing cost as their family expands and they buy a larger house in a more expensive neighborhood, and then also the cost of their car as they upsize their car, and just in general lifestyle creep. For Ronald Read, that seemed to never happen. Now, he bought a home for $12,000 around 1960 when he got married, and he continued to live in that house throughout the rest of his life. Shortly after his military service, he didn't have a family to provide for, and he never raised any children of his own. Instead, only getting married a little bit later in life. He would have been about 39, and his wife's children were then mostly grown, and he did help them through college, but other than that, it seemed that was his major contribution. Reed also didn't seem to spend a lot of money on cars. Toward the end of his life, he was driving a 2007 Toyota Yaris that he bought secondhand. He also had a financial advantage in that he worked well past what we would consider traditional retirement age. Normally, if you want to retire, say at age 65 or maybe a little later at 67, but Ronald Reed continued to work until he was 76. That empowered him to take his earnings and continue to invest into stocks. So what can we learn from Ronald Reed? Well, for one thing, frugality. He watched every penny he earned. Every morning he would go and get a coffee and an English muffin, one of the cheapest things on the menu. And he always dressed in older clothes. One time he was eating at the restaurant, and one of the patrons saw him, thought he wouldn't be able to afford his meal, so he paid for Reed's meal. One of the neighbors saw Reed walking outside in the Vermont winter, and she felt bad for him and thought he was probably having trouble making ends meet. So she actually knitted him a hat. Towards the end of his life, when he was interacting a lot with his lawyer and kind of getting his affairs in order and so on, and when he went to his lawyer's office, he would park way down the street in the free spots because he didn't want to park closer because those spots had a meter, and he did not want to pay to park his car in front of the meter. And to me, that says that he just had a frugality mindset, and that things like not paying for the parking or ordering just the cheapest coffee and English muffin on the menu, small things like that don't really make a big difference in the grand scheme of your personal finances. But it's the mindset that that causes that helps to keep the larger purchases also at bay, like upgrading the car or buying a bigger house. Another thing we can learn from Reed is his mindset for hard work. Growing up on the farm, he worked very hard, and he continued to do that throughout his life. He retired for 1 year, and I'm sure that he found that with all this free time, he didn't like that. He did not enjoy that. So he went back to work because he wanted to stay busy. His attitude of hard work was sort of built into him. Another thing we can learn from Reed is, of course, his consistent investing strategy, where he maintained focus, and he would do his research, and he would continue to invest in the stocks that he had picked and reap the rewards of the dividends, which instead of spending, he would turn around and reinvest again into his stocks. The story of Ronald Reed is inspiring to hear because for so many of us, we make, of course, a much larger salary, and we're in a much better position to invest and save our money. And we hear about someone like Ronald Reed, who had much humbler beginnings, and yet see what he was able to do. And we think to ourselves, maybe we could do the same thing. And for sure we can. And one of the things that Reed had to do in his day and age was individual stock picking, and it took him a long time to look over all the information and make informed decisions on which stocks to buy. But now in this day and age, we don't have to do that. We can simply invest in an ETF for the S&P 500 index fund and be done with it, and we will automatically get market returns. There is one more thing we can learn from Ronald Reed. It's interesting to see that over the course of his life, he invested so much, and at the end of his life, he donated the majority of his wealth to the library and the local hospital. But it stands to question if Reed had his own dreams and his own thoughts of the future that might have extended beyond what the end of his life actually came to. Did he have goals like, did he ever want to travel, maybe back to the countries that he had seen during World War II, but to be able to see and explore them during peacetime? Did he want to stay in touch with his family more? Or maybe he just envisioned making donations to local charities while he was alive and able to see the impact that his money would make? The answer to those questions we'll never know. But here's something you can know. We all need goals. Ask yourself, what are your goals? Having a budget and consistently investing and setting money aside is all great, and we need to do that, but the goal of saving should not be to save. The goal of saving should be to achieve some objective that we want. The goal is not to save, but to save with a purpose. So I ask you, what are your goals? Are they written down? And do you review them regularly? Granted, most of us are on the other end of the spectrum where we have our goals, but we are living for today, and very difficult to set aside money for tomorrow. But once you achieve those savings goals, will you go ahead and take that vacation? Will you take that time off of work to spend with your family? Will you travel to that place that you have always wanted to go? Or will you buy that red couch that you have always wanted but always thought, I'll do it later? It's important to save, but at the same time, it's also important to have goals, to know when it's okay to go ahead and celebrate. If this content was helpful for you, I invite you to subscribe, give it a like, and we'll see you on the next video.